Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. My name is John Rentoul. I'm laughably called Chief Political Commentator at The Independent on Sunday, just to give you a good example of title inflation in modern journalism. I think this is a fascinating topic, today's topic, and I'm grateful to Policy Exchange for launching what I think is one of the most serious debates in politics today, which is about, well, in my view, not whether it was a mistake for the last Labour government to have a target of abolishing child poverty. I mean, I think that was a mistake because it focused far too much on cash transfers and not enough on dealing with the causes of poverty. But the question is, if that was a mistake, what do you do instead? And Neil O'Brien here has been doing some important work on that, and we have a distinguished panel which is going to set out what should be done. Starting with Chris Goulden, of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, or it may be another branch of the Joseph Rowntree empire.
That one.
Sorry, right. You've always got to be careful, especially if you're libeling anybody or accusing anybody of political activity. But anyway, Chris, obviously working for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, knows more about this than almost anybody else in the room. So he will introduce, be followed by David Hillman and Neil, and then we will have lots of time for questions, I hope. So keep it short, chaps.
Yeah, will do. I'll stand up, I think. Well, I think the current debate on poverty is getting us nowhere. Not in this room, of course. We have an excellent one. Everyone seems to agree that money is a central feature of poverty and that there is more to it than that. So why can't we seem to reach any kind of consensus about how to reduce poverty in the UK? The debate seems to get boiled down to an argument over tax credits or universal credit, rather than what would be needed for a comprehensive and evidence strategy against poverty. This would need to focus on the most cost-effective ways of raising the standard of living of people in poverty. There's bound to be a role for welfare benefits here, not least among pensioners. But it's not an either-or question. The labour market is at least, if not more important than benefits, in determining relative standards of living, and that includes retired people. At the moment, we have at least 3 different strands within government that are going in slightly different directions. We've got welfare to work in DWP, a kind of reverse engineering of Gordon Brown within the Treasury, and a longer-term social mobility agenda from education and the Cabinet Office. And the problem with all the strategies we had on poverty is that they don't say how the targets are going to be met. They're usually just a list of existing policies like the work programme or pupil premium, with no explicit link to the outcomes that the strategies are meant to deliver. How many children is the work programme going to take out of poverty on any measure? Some, for sure, but we have no idea how many or if it will lead to permanent improvements. All the myths circulating about poverty seem to prevent progress being made on the basis of evidence about what the issues are and what the best solutions might be. For example, work is the best route out of poverty. On one level, this is almost a truism. If you look at what happens to when an adult from a family in poverty gets a new job, only 56% are out of poverty as a result. This means there's something seriously going wrong with the labour market and the kinds of jobs that people are getting. That's just 56%. So we need to move beyond simple prescriptions based on misunderstandings of what the evidence is really telling us. 3 generations who have never worked. There are around 15,000 households in the UK where there are 2 generations who have never worked. In comparison, there are consistently 6 million people underemployed who want a full-time job but just can't get one. If we focus mostly on the former, we're not going to be tackling the real problem. Tax credits were just aimed at taking people £1 over an arbitrary line, the poverty line. In fact, the IFS have shown that poverty would have fallen on a range of measures of relative income poverty, from 45% below to the actual median. I'm not saying, though, that these objections are unimportant. We do need more jobs, and good quality employment is probably the best route out of poverty. There are some families and areas suffering from an entrenched lack of jobs. Income is not the only measure of poverty, and taking 60% of median is arbitrary. Surely, though, we can live with a little more nuance. It's time to move the debate on and accept that poverty in the UK is a complex and long-term problem. There's nothing magic about the year 2020. It's much more important to assess what impact we're likely to have with the policies and the economy that we've got. We need to use all the tools available to us in a way that breaks through policy silos. So this includes a tax and benefit system that balances the need to provide a decent minimum income with reasonable withdrawal of that support as earnings rise. Universal credit provides a framework for doing this, but the risk is it will not do enough for the basic rates or for the withdrawal rates. We need markets that lead to reductions in the cost and improvements in the quality of essential goods and services. It's not just that people in poverty are likely to pay more for the basics, such as credit or fuel. It's also the cost of mainstream services like childcare, housing and basic goods like food. Investment in longer-term poverty prevention through well-targeted education and skills interventions. Now everyone says that interventions need to be targeted. It's kind of meaningless unless you say how. So what I mean is that targeted on households in poverty, not just the low-skilled or low-paid as a group. The vast majority of low-paid workers aren't in poverty. And most importantly of all, millions of better jobs in the economy. We've modelled the impact of having 1.5 million new jobs by 2020, which is probably more than we're going to get. But even this is not enough to avert the growth in poverty. The risk is that we'll keep going as we have been with the strategies that don't work and ad hoc adjustments to the drivers of poverty. On the basis of current tax and benefit plans, alongside forecasts for jobs and earnings growth and demographic change, we're looking at an absolute income poverty rate, a fixed threshold rate, of 23% for children by 2020. I'm pretty sure that's something none of us want to see happen. But that's the risk if we don't start having proper strategies against poverty. These must be based on evidence about what works and appreciation of the costs of taking action, as well as the huge cost of poverty to society.
Thank you very much. That's given us enough to chew on. David, you want to now provide us with the answers to all those problems. We're very grateful. Can you just explain what stamp out poverty is?
Thank you, John, and thank you, Chris, for those words, and thank you all for coming to this fringe. By way of introduction, my background is in work to drop the debt in developing countries, and in the last few years on generating new sources of finance for international development. So my focus has been on efforts to reduce poverty internationally, but in my most recent work with Stamp Out Poverty, which includes the setting up of the Robin Hood tax campaign, our focus encapsulates both poverty at home and abroad. It's worth saying that unfortunately many people in the UK still think of child poverty as a problem that happens elsewhere. It is not actually happening here. To set out some of the facts, according to Bernardo's, if we use the best known measure of the number of children living below a poverty line set at 60%, arbitrary as you say, of median household incomes, the so-called relative poverty measure, there are about 3.6 million children in poverty in this country. That's 1 in 3 children. And if we take a narrower measure, those living in absolute poverty, where even subsistence is difficult, there's 1.6 million children that are in poverty. Now, I don't think that income is the only measure of child poverty, but if we accept that it is one measure, differences in income clearly produce starkly different outcomes for children. So what do I mean by that? Well, parental income affects, say, health, say, education in respect of health. 3-year-olds in households with incomes below about £10,000 are 2.5 times more likely to suffer chronic illness than children in households with incomes of, say, over £50,000. In respect of education, compared to those children not on free school meals, those who are eligible for free school meals achieved only half the number of GCSE A to C grades. Only 73% of 5 to 6-year-olds from the most deprived areas achieved the expected level of writing, compared to 90% of those in the least deprived areas. So child poverty clearly directly correlates to life opportunities. I've got some other facts and figures. I don't think I need to go into them. I'm sure this audience knows a lot of them. So what can be done about it? The current government has sought to step back from the commitment of the last Labour government to end child poverty by 2020. Bernardo's and others have protested this. You know the argument, it's impossible to deliver on this promise, there's not enough money. But money, we would argue, that can be found, and that this is a clear political choice. The coalition also argues that Labour spent too much on welfare and engendered a cycle of dependency. I think it is reasonable in reply to point out the good work that Labour did in office. The statistics show that child poverty, using the figure of 60% below median, was 18% in 2011, down from 26% in 1999. But what we need to do is rethink the problem. We need to challenge the prevailing narrative that there is no money to help eradicate child poverty, and at the same time suggest that the opportunity to gain work is as important than a narrow focus on a particular measure, such as the level of average incomes. The coalition says that welfare leads to dependency, yet surely high unemployment leads to the most dependency on the state. Solve that, and you go a long way to solving the dependency problem. So far, the current government has woefully failed in that task. If we look at employment, since the general election, unemployment has remained perpetually high. There are 2.5 million people unemployed in this country, with massive regional variation. In the southeast, it's common for less than 2% of local populations to be unemployed, whilst in the north and Scotland, unemployment rates are more than double, sometimes more than 4 times that percentage. And it's definitely worth pointing out that in terms of stimulus, in the US, the economy is now larger in 2000 and larger now than it was by 4%. It's now larger considerably than it was in 2008, whereas ours is 4% less depressed. Our GDP is 4% less. There are more than 1 million unemployed 16 to 24-year-olds. If this group is not found jobs soon, history suggests, and Chris was alluding to this, that they will find it increasingly more difficult to get jobs in future years, and we are therefore storing up an even worse problem down the road when their kids potentially grow up without seeing their parents working. The Tories say remove benefits and people will have a greater incentive to work. I say invest in creating jobs and curbing unemployment, and people will actually be able to work. There is a solution. We need stimulus, we need growth. Without a growing economy, you cannot create the jobs and the opportunities to work for the young to tackle the dependency cycle. So the wider question is, how do you create an economy where employment levels are sustainable, that does not over-rely on a particular sector, and where money is available to invest in projects to create new infrastructure and therefore create new jobs? An option, of course, that we would advocate is the financial transaction tax. It would produce £20 billion of extra tax revenue each year. We would advocate half of this is used to solve chronic poverty abroad, where the economic crash not only cost livelihoods, but also cost lives. And of course, the other £10 billion we would advocate is spent here, spent domestically. So what could a government do with an extra 10 billion a year of domestic spend? And here's just some ideas of what it could do. It could be spent on restoring the educational maintenance allowance. 500 million it would cost to do that. It could provide money for infrastructure investment. Much has been said about a British investment bank. It could provide capital for that bank. That would make a genuine difference. Not the 1 billion that Vince Cable talked about last week. Considerably more in funds, especially as you can leverage it up by 2.5 times. Funding skills programs to get people back into the labour market, reopening the 100+ Sure Start schemes that have closed since the general election. These measures could create jobs for parents now and create the conditions where kids have the aspiration and avenues to better themselves in later years, as well as achieving a rebalancing of our economy over the long term, setting just £1 billion a year aside from the financial transaction tax. That's just 1/10 of the amount would meet the £19 billion figure often cited that's required to eradicate child poverty by 2029. Can the banking sector afford it? Well, the average investment banker bonus at Barclays Capital in 2011 was £104,000, down by £20,000 on the year before, my heart bleeds. That bonus could cover what it takes 3 families, each with 2 children, to subsist for a year. Would it harm the economy? Between 2002 and 2008, the boom years, the financial sector contributed about 193 billion in tax, about half the 378 billion contributed by the manufacturing sector. That would surprise some people. Asking the finance sector to pay more tax to help create jobs, amongst others in the manufacturing sector, seems a fairly reasonable ask, and one parties of all colours should be looking at. As well, I mean, and a lot of people forget this, there's a brain drain to the financial sector. Our brightest minds end up doing the maths for this casino. If the financial transaction tax makes our graduates look more willingly at other sectors than finance, that would be no bad thing. So to wrap up, my overall message is this. With 1 in 3 children in relative poverty, can we really afford not to tax the financial sector more and use the revenue to fund skills programmes and new construction projects that create jobs and restore benefits such as the educational maintenance allowance, all of which promote better life chances? It is time to put the millions of children affected by austerity above the fortunes of a few thousand investment bankers. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, David. Very clear. I haven't heard anything quite so left-wing since the 1970s. Neil.
Good.
So I would probably start from a slightly different place from John, as far as I do think that it was a good thing to set a child poverty target, and quite a lot of progress was made under the last government. But I would also start from a different position to David, insofar as I don't think the next Labour government is going to introduce financial transaction tax, and I don't think it's in any other way going to find a lot of money suddenly down the back of the sofa. So it's going to be much more difficult for the next government to try and pursue the agenda of reducing child poverty. And it's interesting that I think a sort of new consensus is forming that the way forward is to be more focused on tackling the causes of poverty rather than just increasing income transfers. Ed Miliband has said that the option of simply increasing tax credits in the way that we did before will not be open to us. And John Denham has talked about shifting investment from tax credits to affordable childcare. And our kind of opposite numbers at the IPPR have called also for a more strategic approach focused on childcare and ensuring that families who do work are not in poverty. And I think I would agree with a lot of that. So one of the reasons we're having this discussion today is that the government are about to launch a big consultation on reforming the child poverty target. And a lot of you in this room know a lot about it, not all of you will, because the current nature of the child poverty target that we've set ourselves is a sort of inequality target. It's about the difference between people at the bottom of the income distribution and the middle. So it's really a measure of inequality. And that has some interesting consequences. It means that, for example, during recessions, it looks like child poverty isn't as bad as it really is because it drags the middle down, but not the income of people who are on benefits. It leaves you saying some strange things like that effectively poverty in Britain is higher now than it was in the 1970s, when only about half of households had central heating, or that poverty in the UK is higher than it is in Greece or Slovakia, which of course it isn't really. The current measure is also a kind of snapshot measure. That's a problem with it. If you look at the current measure, it would tell you that more than half of households have been in poverty over the last decade. That seems strange. If we say you're in poverty, it doesn't feel like half of the population have been in poverty. It's a very strong word. But all those are kind of technical points. The central problem with the current target and the current strategy has been that it's all been about cash transfers rather than addressing some of the kind of deeper causes of poverty that David talks about. Under the current target, if a government does a lot to reduce unemployment or increase employment, that's not really rewarded in the target. Every time someone who's not a parent takes a job and moves off of welfare, that actually makes child poverty look higher. Also, decreasing people's cost of living isn't rewarded. If you were to build a lot more social housing, as Ed Bowles has been talking about today, that would not score in the child poverty target. In fact, it would probably score as an increase because people would have lower costs and get less housing benefit. Education spending, better schools, doesn't really show up in the current child poverty target. But of course, better schools and things like the last Labour government were doing on schools are probably in the longer term the most effective way to reduce poverty. And none of the things that governments can do that would get at the really deep causes of poverty, like drug addiction, our dysfunctional care system, abusive parents, all those kind of things, none of those things show up in the current target. So, the last government did not have a kind of one club approach. It was trying to do things on all different fronts to deal with poverty. But the overwhelming effort in terms of the amount of money spent went on cash transfers, and you can see that in the money. So at the moment we spend about £22 billion on child tax credit and £12 billion on child benefit, but only £8 billion on rewarding people who work hard on low incomes through working tax credit. And you can see it also, if you look at what happened to people who were lifted out of poverty, the phrase that we used to use a lot, during the last Labour government. More than half of the people who were, quotes, lifted out of poverty were workless and remained workless. They were in completely workless households. And so it is a little strange to say that they are suddenly not in poverty. Their income has certainly gone up a bit, but they're still not working. They may still be living in the same crumbling estate, have lots of the same problems. Their kids might still be going to the same not very good school, and yet we say that we've been lifted out of poverty. So we need an approach which I think is more focused on the root causes. I'm going to quickly mention 4 different ways in which I think that the approach of the next Labour government or this government should be more focused on the root causes of poverty. And the first one is obviously to be more focused on helping people get into work. If you have a lone parent who's working full-time or a couple who are mostly working full-time, then very few of those families end up in poverty. So work really is the best route out of poverty. And so what we could do is flow some of the resources that we spend currently on out-of-work benefits or on middle-class benefits and flow them into rewarding those who work hard on low incomes, increasing working tax credits, particularly for people with children. We could do a lot more on every other type of welfare reform as well, and particularly to sort out the welfare system, to stop the people who, in the JRF's very memorable phrase, are kind of bumping along the runway. They're unemployed for a bit, they get a job for a little bit, but then they find themselves back on benefits, and they go along year after year, cycling in and out of poverty. So that's the first thing I'd do to get more focused on the causes of poverty. I'd focus on work as a route out. The second big thing I'd do is I'd look more at people's cost of living, and particularly housing. So back in the 50s, the early 60s, people were spending about a tenth of their income on average on housing. Now, because housing is so expensive, it's been growing, the cost of housing has been going up 3 times faster than incomes over the last decade. People now spend about a fifth of their income on housing, and there are a huge number of people who are pushed into poverty by the very expensive rents that they have to pay. In fact, the gap between poverty before and after people's housing costs, that now accounts for about 1/7 of all poverty. I mean, in fact, the housing market has done not as much, but very nearly as much as Mrs. Thatcher's government to increase poverty. And that's an amazing thing. So we obviously got to get more focused on building a lot more houses, getting down people's cost of living in lots of different ways. If I were the government do have a very broad strategy of trying to deal with child poverty, but I'd be much more focused on the kind of families and the kind of groups that the government already has a lot of contact with. For example, the 350,000 children who are living with drug-dependent parents. Now, I know that 350,000 of them only from a survey that the DWP did about 10 years ago. So we're not really tracking these people, we're not really actively managing them. They are the people whose children are very, very likely to end up in poverty and going round and round in a cycle. We need to think more about the 60,000 children who are in care. Again, they are much, much more probable than anybody else to end up in poverty later in life. Children of people with mental health issues, children of people who've been in prison, all these children are very, very likely to end up in poverty, and we don't do enough to manage them, even though government has an awful lot of contact with them. And the absolute last thing I would recommend is that the new government or the next Labour government should pilot some kind of successor to Sure Start. Sure Start was clearly the right sort of thing to be looking at. We know that the early years matter a lot. We know that that's when the investments in education can pay off the most. But Sure Start, unfortunately, if you look at the national evaluation, is not helping children to be more ready for school. It's not helping their cognitive development enough. And that is partly because we're trying to do a lot of different things on really quite a small budget. If you look at schemes in the US, that are properly scientifically evaluated, randomised control trials and so on. Those schemes are firstly a lot more expensive than Sure Start, and secondly they're a lot more educationally focused than it is. At the moment, as the various former Labour ministers have said, Margaret Hodges said, we shouldn't have tried to expand it so fast, we tried to do too many things with not enough money. Tessa Jowell said, we should have shaped it more, we did try to make it do too many things. And that's really the story of Sure Start. So what we need is a pilot of something much deeper, which has much better chance of actually getting children to be doing better at school, and really helps to close the education gap between the poorest children and the rest. Because in the long run, that is the ultimate driver of poverty and inequality in the country. And unless we can do something that really helps to close that very, very big gap, then we're really never going to do enough to reduce child poverty or increase children's life chances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. That's extremely thought-provoking. Now, who would like to ask questions? Difficult questions only, please. And no political statements. If you could say who you are and who you're addressing a question to. Yes.
Oliver Chandler from Bernardo's. Neil, really interested to hear your focus on children in care, obviously are at risk of negative outcomes in their lives. What in particular would you do to help those children and to stop them from falling into poverty?
Shall we take questions in threes? Lady in the middle here.
Alison Marshall from UNICEF UK. Thanks for your remarks, they were all really interesting. And Neil, the way you talked about child poverty, the 60% measure, as being a measure of inequality, as if somehow that was a bad thing, surprised me, because the spirit level showed us all very clearly that societies that are more equal do better. So I'll be interested in a comment on that. But my question for all the panellists actually is whether they think encouraging and promoting all employers to pay the living wage would make a significant difference to child poverty.
Good question. Although I think the thing about inequality and poverty, if we start that debate today, then I'll be here all day. Gentleman at the back with the red tie.
Question for Chris. You mentioned the thorny problem of underemployment being essential to dealing with these sorts of issues, as well as unemployment. And malfunction in the labour market, if you like, was creating that. How would you suggest we could tackle underemployment as opposed to just dealing with unemployment?
Very good. Neil, do you want to reply first? And then we'll go this way.
On the care system, you have to do something on every single front. So for children who are on the edge of care and might end up in it, but we might be able to avoid them going into it in the first place. I mean, Andrew Adonis has got some interesting thoughts on kind of residential care for children on the edge of care, boarding schools and things like that. I think that's an interesting thing to explore. Then for children who are in the system, I mean, I would try and further accelerate the adoption process, because that's obviously the best outcome, and I think there's more you can do there. I'd try and professionalise fostering a bit more, and probably think about the pay of foster carers, because you've got much more difficult kids coming through it now. I would probably try and close the education gap again. We've got, in statute, every child in the care system is entitled to go absolutely top of the list for entry into any school in the country, but we're not good enough about being a pushy parent for them, so they don't actually get sent to the best schools, which is a shame. And I think more about post-care, care leavers, and their mental health particularly, because a lot of the classic cycle in care is people who are in care end up having kids who go into care, and round and round we go. So that's, I mean, I just hit every single part of it a lot. On this point about inequality and poverty, I didn't say that trying to reduce inequality was a bad thing. I think you've got to be clear about what you're trying to achieve, though, and I suppose the point I was trying to make overall is we've just been, I think, a bit too focused on, we have lifted X children out of poverty because we have made this one-off cash transfer to them, rather than addressing the underlying cause, which, I mean, central to which is worklessness. I mean, if we had £19 billion every year, we could abolish child poverty on the current target as it stands by just increasing child benefit. But if we did have £19 billion extra a year to spend, I would not recommend that you just spend it on increasing child benefit. I would suggest focusing on a successor to Sure Start, maybe on job creation, on making work pay better, because those are all more like real investments. Gordon Brown always used to talk about investments, because investments earn a return. You don't just spend the money and then you need to spend it again the next year. You do things that more permanently solve the problem. And that's really the crux of what I'm trying to say.
Chris?
Yeah. On the living wage, I think any single policy is not enough by itself. You've got to, what I was trying to say when I was talking is that we haven't really seen how all these things interact together. And there's still a focus on individual policies in the current government that you had under the last government. So if you take raising the income tax threshold, that's put forward as a poverty alleviating tool. But if you're taking away the increases in net income through withdrawal of benefits, as is likely to happen under universal credit and happens now under certain parts of the benefit system, there's two kind of parts of government working against each other when it comes to what the actual impact is on real people's standard of living. So I just think that there's a lack of joined upness, which is always the case, but it does seem to be worse now. And maybe
Well,
it's
that's because it's a Liberal Democrat policy.
well, there's a lot of Conservatives seem to be quite in favour of it. Is my impression. And the trouble with living wage is that it's probably better for transferring money back to the state than it is for alleviating poverty, so that the private sector is paying more, but the people themselves are not necessarily getting extra income because particularly if they're claiming all the benefits to which they're entitled to. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's probably a good thing that you're transferring responsibility for tackling poverty to different sectors. You're evening out the responsibility across all the sectors. And I think that applies to a lot of the things you were suggesting. It's about transferring responsibility between different sectors and getting the right balance there. And again, that applies to the labour market. I think it's really tricky to know what to say about how you create more and better jobs. But I think we need to move the debate on from work is the best route out of poverty to good quality, long-term, progressive jobs are the route out of poverty. Going back to the figure in my talk, 56% of families are still in poverty when someone in that family gets a new job. If you look at the risks statically, they are very different, but they're different kinds of people. You've got to look at the dynamic data on work being a route out of poverty.
Yeah, I mean, I agree and disagree. I mean, your stat is obviously right. I mean, the issue in a lot of these cases is that people aren't getting enough hours. They're on a very small number of hours, on not much pay, and of course they remain.
So it's insecure jobs, low hours, low pay.
And if we did it over a year, it would be even more interesting because you might be in a decent-ish job for a little bit, but it's only for a month, and then you're back on the dole again. And so this is why we're trying to get some sort of better measure of poverty is important, because otherwise you're missing all these people who are, you're just not noticing there's all these people in a lot of trouble. On the living wage thing, I mean, that all started, of course, as London living wage, big focus on cost of living in London. And that's very interesting for this debate, because of course our current poverty target says you need the same amount of money everywhere in the country. That's obviously not correct. And if you compare the relative poverty measure, the main measure, and the material deprivation measure, which is not having stuff, in most of the country they're fairly similar. But in London, relative poverty doesn't look too bad, but material deprivation is sky high. And that tells you something interesting about the need to maybe do something more nuanced about London.
Very good. David?
Well, I don't really have a lot to add. I mean, I'd go with Ed Balls's line in his speech just now, but he's encouraging all employers to pay the living wage. Chris' comments notwithstanding.
Very good. Let's take some more questions. There's a lady at the back there.
I'll stand up because I'm feeling quite short down there. My name's Sally Copley, I'm from Save the Children. I was going to make a comment about men in suits on the panel, but I was also wearing a suit, so that But I wanted to say something. You said challenging questions, and my question is about stigma. There's an awful lot of things that Save the Children would say about living wage, about the fact that most parents in poverty actually have a job. Most kids in poverty have a parent with a job. And we've talked about low-paid and secure jobs, and we work with families all over the country where the kids just want to see their dad more because he's working 60 hours a week in 2 different jobs. So we see that, but what's really pernicious about the debate so much, and I just want to say publicly, Neil, I really welcome your tone and the things that you're saying seem different to me to how they were previously for the policy exchange, and I think that's really needed because we really vilify the poor families in the UK. We talk about families in a way that is described them as work shy, lazy, feckless, it's their fault, it's not my business to help children who don't have enough to eat. And I think I just wanted to ask the panel what they would do, what you would each do. I would be the chair on that as well, please. What would you do to change language about how we talk about families who are living in poverty, children growing up in poverty, that would actually make a difference? Because I think the real challenge for child poverty in the UK is getting the public behind us, and we're not going to do that unless we start being able to talk about it in a way that requires and demands empathy.
Very good. So question at the front here, and then somebody else in the back.
I'm Bill Turner, I'm a Labour League member in Town Hamlets for Children's Services, but I also work as a manager in safeguarding for another local authority. One thing I find frustrating is there's a sort of dissonance between people either talk about long-term preventative strategies or what we do here and now for children and their families living in poverty, often very much the coalface of things. But I think beyond that as well, one of the things the last government maybe didn't get right, it was a very nationally based strategy. And actually, if you think of interventions that are going to work, 8 or 9 out of 10 of them are going to be delivered by local authorities at a local level. The voice of the voluntary sector is quite prominent in this debate, as are national think tanks with a sort of national picture. And so on that, I just wonder what kind of prescriptions, what suggestions would you have for local authorities to manage both the preventative and the immediate kind of consequences of child poverty in the context of the spending reductions that they're all faced with.
Very good. Any more questions from the back? No? Neil.
So, in
Sally's welcomed your change of tone.
I'm not sure my tone has changed, but there we go. I'll welcome your welcoming anyway. And also welcome the only person, Chris, who's actually wearing a tie as well, so you're much more smartly dressed than the rest of us. On stigmatisation, okay, yeah, so there is, I think you're right, there is big stigmatisation of, but sometimes inaccurate. I mean, the central thing, I think what I'm suggesting would help with what you're worrying about, which is if we can create a system where, you know, we have got this, it's a very boring point, but kind of the balance of rights and responsibilities that, you know, we have created a system which enables people to progress and bring themselves out of poverty, and they take that responsibility and make it happen for themselves. I think that, just that basic but very boring kind of narrative about rights and responsibilities is the one that gets you away from stigmatisation, I think. I mean, I think on disability, I think there's probably some sort of specific things. I mean, I've got quite interested in how the sort of composition of people on incapacity benefit in ESA has changed, and the kind of incredible rise of mental illness. And I'm not quite sure what to do about that. I think it's a genuine thing. I mean, I have seen, there don't seem to be any good data, but people anecdotally keep saying that hate crime against people with disabilities has gone up. And I don't know, are there actually any numbers on that? Oh, there are proper numbers. Okay.
I'm sure Scope has come out recently. Scope has come out or during the Paralympics.
Yeah. That I think is an issue, but I'm not quite sure what the answer is. I suspect you may.
I mean, if I could just say on the language, I mean, I think it is a problem that, you know, a lot of journalism, not the Independent on Sunday, obviously, but a lot of journalism is about fecklessness and benefit dependency and so on. And I think that, but I do think the only way to deal with that, as Neil suggests, is to try to remove the perverse incentives in the benefit system that actually, I mean, sometimes do encourage people to abuse the system or to not work. I mean, I think that applies to a minority of claimants, clearly, but it certainly applies to enough people to worry a lot of people who feel that they're paying good money for people who work less hard than them to milk the system. I think that, you know, unless you can eliminate some of those perverse incentives from the system, you're never going to get rid of the idea of scroungers and benefit dependency. Chris, do you have any?
On the language, I think the mindset is the key thing. That thinking about people on low incomes or people in poverty as other is the key thing to try and get beyond. And if politicians and people in the media could stop referring to them and more to us, you know, there's lots of us have been brought up by a single parent who was on benefits for a while, or lots of us have lost our jobs for a while. So this figure that half of us have experienced low income, even if it's not poverty, relative low income, is something that means that we should be able to understand that people in poverty aren't different to us. It's all in inverted commas. So that's the key thing I think that I would change. And in terms of the benefit system, I think the more politicians talk about fraud, the more it encourages fraud. Because if people think everyone else is on the make, then that kind of breaks that bond, that kind of deal in the benefit system. So I think, you know, it's basic behavioural psychology, isn't it? Really, that you need to talk more about that people on benefits are very responsible, and then that would kind of keep the circle.
David, do you want to?
Well, on language is a very important thing, but we have to understand some of the politics of it, and it's part of it is placing the blame away from government and putting it on people in the media. Unfortunately, seem to collude with that. I think it's very important to follow on from what Chris was saying. We need examples out there. Politicians should say, you know, if they have come from a single parent family and they've been through these, they should use these kind of examples so that you're creating those kind of models out there so that you can try to get rid of the, you know, this holding of people in poverty in this way. I think as more people become unemployed in this next phase, it's become more and more salient. And since we've had questions already from, say, UNICEF and Bernardo's, I think it would be very good if you put your heads together on some kind of proactive campaign to do with these stigmatisation. I think that, you know, working from a background of networks of organisations working together, I think that can be an extremely powerful way of getting messages across.
On the point about kind of local approaches, I mean, the last government, in fairness, did get every local authority to draw up its own anti-poverty strategy in England anyway. And it is all very different. I mean, Tower Hamlets is an incredible outlier. Poverty in your local authority looks very different to everywhere else. I mean, what can you do? I mean, one thing I think is a possibility is trying to give more control over the work programme or bits of what are currently done by job centres to local authorities. And I mean, the future is definitely kind of minimising the role of job centres as they are now, just doing the same stuff everywhere. And I think there's probably an opportunity, particularly for some ethnic minority groups, to have some kind of more locally focused employment type of stuff going on, because the rates are so different. I mean, some ethnic minorities have almost no unemployment, some incredibly high. So having some more kind of differentiation there, as long as you don't then make other people feel like some people are being specially treated and drunk with a load of grievances doing that, I think that could be an interesting thing to do.
I mean, it's not very helpful, but I think it's extremely difficult at local level to have proper strategies against poverty because there's so much that's out of your hands. But having said that, a lot of the strategies I've read suffer from the same problems as the national strategies. They set out some targets on things that you can measure, and they set out things that you can do, and that's the strategy. There's nothing in the middle. Well, but it's just because it's so difficult and complex to understand. But it's got to come down to working on the labour market in terms of what jobs the residents in your area are doing, and it's very difficult to understand because it's so mixed, isn't it? But local authorities can do a lot more about their labour markets, and there doesn't seem to be a link between economic development and kind of anti-poverty departments within local authorities.
What do you think of what was done in Newham? I mean, they seem to be quite innovative. They've used local government jobs and things like that to do kind of welfare to work things. I don't know what.
I mean, there was some discussion specifically around children and care system, and I think I was one of a number of people who were discomforted at the KFC Bernardo's fringe and having young people in the care system working for free at KFC, and my local authority and a number of others have very specific kind of outcomes needed for children in our care system to actually be working within our council. That if we're a corporate parent, then we should frankly hang our heads in shame if our local young people aren't employed by ourselves as an employer. I think more generally, the Newham project's interesting, but what it hasn't been able to do is look at the needs of children. If you're talking about worklessness, then it's going to take a long while in children's short lifespans to filter down for the needs of children on the ground, because obviously it's the parents who are getting the jobs. And I think the issue really is that so many of the outcomes are focused on adults and work, and actually for very many children in London, that might work fine on a 5 or 10 year trajectory, but that's irrelevant when you're 5, isn't it? Because that's half your childhood. And so that's why I think we need many more practical things on the ground for local authorities. I think we've had some really good discussion about early intervention, but again, there tends to be a focus on strategy rather than actually looking at the outcomes for our community at this point in time. You know, there are some good things going, but I think it's fewer than it should be in the current climate, really.
Any more questions from the floor? Yes, we've got a question over here.
One quick question for Neil. Obviously, the Policy Exchange are advocating the use of regional pay in the public sector. I'm just wondering,
We're doing local pay.
Local pay, sorry. How do you think there's any correlation between that and obviously what we're trying to achieve generally regarding poverty, and how that will have what impacts that would have on local economies and
Exactly. So our version of the kind of local pay argument involved, instead of using the money you might save in some parts of the country to transfer it to expensive parts of the country, instead taking that money and spend it in the poorer parts of the country. So we worked out that you could probably create about 288,000 jobs in the poorer parts of the country. We obviously think that would have a good impact in terms of reducing poverty in the poorest bits of the country. So, I mean, I would make an argument for the version of that we support being quite an effective way of reducing poverty.
So you'd lower wages and employ more people in poorer parts of the country?
You look at the bits of the country where the public sector doesn't have any problems recruiting, and it's spending quite a lot of money on people there. And instead of having a few lucky people getting paid a lot, you end up using that money to employ more people, potentially in the public sector or in the private sector. So you're kind of spreading that resource around, but keeping all the money within the poorer areas rather than transferring it somewhere else.
I'd say that was all right as long as Ed Balls was Chancellor, but not under the present government. Anybody?
I was going to say, in relation to an earlier point, the cost of living doesn't vary as much as you'd think outside London. So there's only 5% difference across the UK outside London.
So you're not looking at house prices as well in there, though.
No.
You're just looking at CPI.
Yeah.
But I mean, house prices are hugely vary around the country, so the real cost of living does vary a lot. And also, I mean, wages are about 30.
It's a housing problem, not a price.
Yeah, but
problem generally.
it's still
not that they're disconnected.
still a big problem. I mean, wages are about 13% higher in the southwest than they are in Wales, for example. So I mean, there are big differences outside London at the moment. We have a London premium, but we don't have a Manchester premium or a Leeds premium or anything like that, even though there are these other big variations.
Yeah.
Very good. Is this a difficult question?
Well, I've been scratching my head. I'm Tanya English from St Mungo's, the homeless organisation, and I thought I was going to be asking a question about, I don't know, the most destitute on the streets. And interestingly, the most destitute on the streets are actually people who haven't got recourse to public funds in this country. And I've been thinking, have we been having this whole debate in a slight bubble? Because in fact, it's poverty in Europe overseas, effectively. That is, there's a whole migrant labour thing that's going on, which is actually making all of our desire to help people move off the welfare dependency much harder. Now, I'm not trying to make an anti-immigration point at all, but nobody seems to make.
No, but you are raising a very important, difficult problem.
It's just like there's a bit of an elephant in the room going on here, isn't there?
Well, I'm very glad you raised it because I was going to, but I didn't want to. But it does seem to me that the idea of magically creating 1.5 million new jobs in this country is a little fanciful if they're all going to be filled by Poles.
Well, that was the forecast from academics at Warwick University a few years ago. It's probably gone down since then.
So there's two things in your question. One is about the street homeless, and doing kind of outreach stuff with street homeless people is one of the things that's kind of opened my eyes to. It's made me think a lot about the nature of poverty in Britain, because they are, by default, the people who've kind of fallen through every crack again and again and again to end up right down being street homeless. And the kind of the mix, I mean, what I was struck by is every street homeless person seems to have basically the same CV, all in the care system, all in and out of jail, all got some kind of drink or drug issue, normally all three. Now, this is not to say it's all their fault, but that is the common CV, and they are very, very hard people to work with. I mean, the work programme at the moment in it has the street homeless bundled in with the same price on their heads as a bunch of other groups, so they will be parked. The work programme is going to do nothing for them, because you could spend an incredible sum of money on these guys and you would struggle to ever get them into work. I think you probably need a very different price on their heads if you're going to make work programme providers do anything for them. So, I mean, I think that it's an important thing in two ways, partly because it's an important thing in itself, and because of all the misery and the mayhem of being street homeless, but also because if you reverse back to look at how those people got there in the first place, it tells you about all the gaps in the systems that we've got, particularly the care system. That's what always gets me.
And the elephant in the room?
And the elephant in the room. Well, I'm not sure what you want to do about it. I mean, it's certainly true that in street homelessness, again, you see the A8 countries are now a big part of the population on London streets. I mean, it's illegal to do anything about it under European law. So unless you are going to leave the EU, you're not going to do anything about migration from within Europe. I mean, it's just, I'm not sure what one is going to do about that, other than say you'd have to do better on every other part of the kind of the things we've been talking about today. I mean, the only bit where you've got any control is extra European migration, which the government are trying to do various things on at the moment. And the challenge, it seems to me, has always been what most people want is a kind of controlled migration, but some kind of clever filter so that we get the best and the brightest, and we don't have people with low skills coming to compete with the low skilled in Britain. But actually achieving that turns out to be quite a complicated thing to do, and not as easy as it sounds.
David, do you want to add anything on?
Well, I'd say in terms of jobs going to Poles, if a proportion of our working population come from these countries, and so essentially it doesn't change the fact that increasing the amount of employment, some of that will go to what are called, indigenous people from this country, but the others, you're going to increase the sum total of which a proportion are going to be coming from these countries, and what you're going to be doing is generating more money for the economy. This is multiplied and multiplier effect. So I'm not sure how much of a problem it is. It is the state of play of our, of the people who are the working people of this country, and they come also from other countries.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've solved all the problems of redefining poverty in this country. Thank you to all the members of the panel. And thank you all for coming, and carry on the debate elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.